Hello, grade 3 Plum Coulee students. Mrs. Weens here. I have missed you guys so much, and I'm excited to catch up with you. I had a great fun unit planned. I was going to teach you about ancient civilization. So ancient civilization just talks about what life was like a very long time ago in certain cities. And more specifically, it talks about how certain cities and people who lived in those cities were really, really smart, and they were advanced for their time. They were doing really smart, their ways of living were really intelligent. And so we are now studying how they lived and what they did and what life was like there. So if you're wondering why I'm wearing this, every day I'm going to come on here and I'm going to read you a book, and I'm going to try to create something fun for our ancient civilization unit. So today we're going to talk about ancient Egypt in particular. And the women in ancient Egypt, they often wore a lot of jewelry if they had money. They wore these tiaras. So I'm wearing a tiara today. I'll try to do something fun every day. But I'm going to focus on reading this book, which is called Who Was King Tut? So he was a king, obviously, because the title tells us that. But he was a very famous ancient Egyptian. So we're going to read about him. I'm going to read a couple chapters every day. You also have a workbook that Mrs. Gavigan sent home with you. And some of the answers to the questions are in this book. They're also in that booklet. So I want to have fun reading this. I had lots of fun things planned for school, but unfortunately we can't do it at school. So maybe I'll try to do some here too with you guys. But it is really neat. There's lots of cool things to learn about ancient civilization. So here we go. Who was King Tut? Chapter 1. When Tut was born around 1343 BC, Egypt was already very old, almost 2,000 years old in fact. The Egyptian Empire lay on the coast of northern Africa, facing the Mediterranean Sea. It was a land of desert and bare hills. So do you think it was warm or cold there? I think you probably know. It was very hot, where the sun beat down all year long, so they never had any cool seasons. There was very few trees, so that meant they don't have any shade, and rain hardly ever came. But the Nile River, which runs north and south, split the country in two. The Nile is the longest river in the world, a little more than 4,000 miles long. It was the heart of ancient Egypt. All along the riverbanks was rich farmland. Peasant farmers tilled their fields with plows pulled by oxen. They sprinkled seeds in the soil to grow wheat and vegetables. They raised pigs and goats and sheep. They planted fruit and trees and grew grapes. The river also gave people fish to eat and ducks to hunt. So that river was a real source of life for them, right? A lot of food and their livelihood came because of that long river. If they didn't have it, it would be too hot there for them to survive. Because of yearly flooding, there were many weeks where farmers could not work. So the river also provided vacation time for everyone. So that meant we don't have to work. Let's at least relax and have fun on the river. So here's a picture of some ancient Egyptians in a boat on the river. The river was called the Nile River. I want you to remember that. The Nile was the road that boats traveled, bringing goods from city to city. Clay from Nile mud was used to build houses. Okay, so they got their food from the Nile. They traveled on the Nile, right? They transported items on the Nile. Now they were getting their products to build their houses from the Nile. So it was clay. All the great cities, like Thebes and Memphis, grew up near the river. Ancient Memphis may have been the first city in the world to have 1 million people. So it's a lot of people. From rock quarries, heavy blocks of stone were brought on barges. They were used to build great temples and statues, some of which are still standing today. So they must have their work probably was very quality, that it lasted this long. The river was the livelihood of the people. Without it, there would have been no ancient Egypt. So that's important to remember. Without that Nile, they wouldn't have existed. would have been just desert. But the desert was important too. It protected Egypt. It was difficult for enemies to attack. They had to cross so many miles of sand in the blazing heat. At one time, the empire stretched from present-day Egypt south to what is now Ethiopia. So that's down in Africa. East into the Sinai Peninsula and north to what is now Lebanon and Turkey. From these other lands came ivory, fur, gold, cedar, and wood. So there were a lot of resources that they could use. But even as the empire grew and grew, the Egyptian way of life stayed pretty much the same. The Egyptians did not take up the customs of the other people. Over thousands of years, they believed it did not change, and it didn't. For instance, their ruler was called the Pharaoh. The word originally means the great house, where the king lived. As time went on, it came to mean the king himself. But the Pharaoh was far more than a king. The Pharaoh was also the highest priest of their land, or like the highest judge. He was considered a very important son. No one knows the exact date in 1343 BC when King Tut was born. Who were his parents? Even that is not known for sure. But they think his father was probably a pharaoh named Amenhotep. The pharaoh had, Amenhotep the fourth. Sorry. By the time King Tut was 10, he already was married. Can you imagine that? Being married at 10 years old? His wife was one of the pharaoh's daughters, and her name was Anankhesenum. By this time, King Tut's father had died. Now Tut became the king. He wore all the tall crowns that the pharaohs would wear. So you can see in this picture here what they put on his head. They're called tall crowns. He also, like all the other kings, he wore a false beard. So it's a pretend beard that they just strap over his ears, and then he wears that. And he carried a crook and a flail, so it kind of looks like a whip. These were all symbols of power. But did he have real power? Absolutely not. He was just a little 10-year-old person, just like you guys are. He was still just a child. Chapter 2, An Unusual Father. Of all the pharaohs who ruled Egypt, Tut's father had to be one of the strangest. First of all, it was the way he looked. So I want you to close your eyes and think about this. His head was very oddly shaped. So we kind of have a round head. He didn't. His was very oddly shaped. It was very long and very narrow. So very, very skinny. His hips were very, very large. So under his tummy, he had big, big hips that went out. Some people thought maybe he had a disease. Some historians are thinking that because he looked so strange. In spite of his looks, Amenhotep married a very beautiful queen. 2 museums, one in Cairo and one in Berlin, own a bust of her. So that's like a sculpture of her. Her name was Nefertiti. Although she wasn't born into a royal family, she looked very much like a queen. So she was just beautiful. Nefertiti became Tut's wife. Women in ancient Egypt did not have the same rights as men. For example, they were not allowed to attend school. But Nefertiti was a very powerful woman, and she advised her husband to make some changes. So the book just talks a little bit about her now for a while, and that's not something that we really need to study. So I'm just going to skip over that. Okay, so Tut and his wife lived in a city called Amarna, and it spread for 8 miles on either side of the Nile River. Here again, Amenhotep wanted to do something different. Usually the land west of the river was where the dead were buried. Why? Because the sun sets in the west on the evening. Just as the sunset brings an end to the day, death brings an end to life on earth. So the dead were buried on the west lands. But Amenhotep decided to do the opposite in his new city. A cemetery was built on the east side of the river. The west side was where people lived. New homes and places were built, as well as temples, all as well. Before this, temples had long hallways that led into dark inner rooms. The new temples were now open-air buildings that let the light of the sun in. So he made a few changes there. The pharaoh also wanted to change the style of painting, so he wanted to change how people did some art. The old style had many rules for artists to follow. So if you were an artist and you wanted to draw a picture of people, these are the rules you had to follow. A person was always shown from the side. A head was always shown in profile, with one eye looking straight at the viewer. So it would be like this. So I'd be turned to the side, one eye would look at you, and the other eye wouldn't. A person's face always looked young and perfect. So you're never allowed to draw an old person. You're never allowed to draw someone that looked a little bit different. It always had to be, everyone had to look perfect all the time. No wrinkles or gray hair. Both shoulders would face the front, but the torso, so at your hips, had to be shown turned. So it's called in profile. One leg was always placed directly in front of the other. The paintings were often very beautiful, but the people in them never looked natural. So this is a picture of how they had to draw. So you see both feet had to point in one direction. The torso is turned, and then you see the one eye looking there, and then you don't see where the other eye is looking. Why were there so many rules for artists? The ancient Egyptians believed that a painting of a dead person might come to life. So it needed to include all the parts of the body. An arm and leg could not be left out, and the person would want to look their best when they were young, not when they are old and sick. But Amenhotep decided to change these rules. He wanted to be portrayed as he really looked, with his long head, his narrow eyes, and his big hips. He also wanted paintings of people to seem more natural, not so formal. So this is a painting that was done, and it shows Amenhotep and his wife playing fondly with 3 of their 6 little daughters. Never before had a family or a painting ever been drawn like this. So he was the first to create real-life paintings of what real people look like. So he doesn't look perfect. Maybe his children or his wife don't look perfect, and that's okay. That's what he wanted. This is how we are. The changes, however, did not last. They were stopped as soon as he died. He was the pharaoh for about 16 years. The new city of Ramana, so that's the city he created, was soon deserted after he died. The old customs were brought back. It must have been a very confusing time for the whole country. Just when people were getting used to all these new changes that he had done, they were told to forget them. Even if Tut had already become a grown man, it would have been very difficult for him to become a pharaoh. So that's it for today. I just want to read 2 chapters a day. I want you to think about everything we learned, because we learned a lot. We learned about where ancient Egypt is. We learned about the Nile. We learned about what pharaohs are. We learned about King Tut and how old he was when he became king. So a lot of the work that we gave you asks those important questions, and I gave you a lot of answers today. So I hope you have fun discovering ancient Egypt and ancient civilization. And I'll be on here again tomorrow, and we'll read some more. Have a great day.